Hello, my name is Briese. I'm an independent crop consultant in Central North Dakota. I work primarily in Stutsman and Barnes counties, and I work directly for several farmers. So, what I do in general is check fields for pest problems and issues, report to the farmer, and help them with problem solving and tools that they can use to manage those problems. Today, the problem I was asked to talk about is water. And basically, it seems like in North Dakota, every year we have too much and not enough. So, we're going to talk about a few tools for managing water and how we can use them, yeah, and some of the signs that will help us understand that. So, like you said, again, even this last year in 2020, where I had almost 40% of the acres that I tend to look at going unplanted because they were too wet. We had this situation in several wheat fields on the western part of Stutsman County where it did not rain for a long time. And so this wheat is just literally dying through lack of moisture. And had we had a way to trap more moisture in the soil, this wheat would have done better in these spots. It was very poor in these areas, as you can see, didn't even make it much above my ankle, and this wheat just really did not have a chance. More problems associated with lack of moisture and other issues related to that. Obviously, we have a little bit of wind in North Dakota. We've seen that recently, and we normally see that every spring. This is a photo from a couple years ago, but I literally could take it every year. We get into the 30-mile-an-hour wind every year. With no residue and lack of soil structure, it's very easy for this soil to pick up and leave the field due to wind. Finally, this is more what this last year, 2020, looked like in my territory. Lots and lots of ponded water, lots of water to cross, wet soils, too muddy, very cold, very wet for most of the spring, which, like I said, resulted in almost 40% of the acres I normally look at not being planted. Although this is a nice picture, this is supposed to be a trail and this is part of the field. We simply just had too much water for too long this spring, and it caused a lot of issues. So, what are some of the tools that we have to manage water? Well, the obvious ones are drainage for sure. Now, we all know that in central North Dakota, this is fairly highly regulated. How we do and do not do drainage is part of the legal system. So it's not just something that we just do anywhere that we can. And for the most part, anywhere that you can do drainage, it has been done. Surface drainage is common, and maintaining those surface drains, keeping them clean, keeping them functional is an important part of your water management. And then a lot of people will also think tillage for water management, and that while that does work, it is primarily through evaporation. And there are some problems, and I'll talk a little bit about that. What I want to focus on, though, is using crops and cover crops to manage water. The plant roots are one of the most important tools that we have to manage water. So here we have some more pictures from this last season. This is an area where the farmer had to use some vertical tillage to try to dry the surface out in order to plant this field. At the time, we didn't think it was a bad idea, but following that vertical tillage, he went for a long period of time with no additional rainfall. And at the time of the vertical tillage, it was too wet. We knew it was too wet. He knew it was too wet, and he wanted to try to get this crop planted. And so what happened is he worked the soil too wet. It caused compaction. It caused loss of aggregates and structure. And we ended up with these thick bricks out here in this field and very poor seed germination, very poor seed to soil contact. Had one rain and this would have been different. But in this situation, we were not able to manage the evaporation. We were not able to manage the tillage to get it to stop losing water. And so we ended up with bricks in this field. And the frustrating part of this, these bricks were as deep as the tillage that he did. Right underneath, there was again excessive moisture. So where the seed was placed in this zone, it dried out and turned into bricks. Underneath of that was mud and wet, caked up soil. So very inefficient way of managing water. And this is really what I see commonly with most tillage practices is that we're losing water primarily through evaporation, and we have little to no control over how that happens. Again, tillage to try to manage water, and this is showing you how poorly this water infiltrated or soaked into the soil. At this point, the water went down to the depth of tillage, and that was about as far as it went, and it ponded above that. And here I'm standing, and this is the very depth of the tillage. I sunk into where the tillage was done, and it stood there. So there's a compaction layer or a restrictive layer right there, right below where the tillage was done. The very next kitty corner field, this is again the same farmer, same soil types. He's trying some reduced tillage systems. This is about 3-year no-till. So it's identical soil type, identical rainfall, and you see that this handled the water much better. There's still ponded water out here, but it did handle the water much better. And on top of that, there is structure there, there is support there. But really the big key to this whole thing is the aggregates, the chunks of soil. This is what you want your soil to look like. We want them to be little Lego blocks supported and held together, and rather than flour or fine granular soil. This is what you're hoping for. And one of the ways that you get this is by root systems and then reducing your tillage. Tillage is what breaks these apart, and the roots are what build them up. And even in wet conditions, you can have strong, stable aggregates like we have on this picture. This is a very wet soil at this point, but when you crush it apart, there are still aggregates in here holding structure, giving you some weight carrying capacity, giving you some air pores in these spaces. There is still some air in these spaces, even though this soil is quite wet. So one of the things that we do to measure this type of stuff and get an understanding is use an infiltration test. This is simply a 6-inch ring of old irrigation pipe. You pound it in with a hammer and a wood block, and you pour a 400 milliliter bottle of water on this and time it to see how long it takes for the water to go through. Now, if this soil is incredibly dry, you don't really time the first one. You want to let that go in because it'll just flow through the pores. And then the second one will be more adequate a representation of how fast this water does infiltrate into the soil. And you can use these as representative times. I wouldn't necessarily compare them to the neighbors or to another state or another part of the state, but you can do this again and again in your field to manage your practices over time. And this does respond within a year or 6 months. Sometimes you'll see differences in how fast the water infiltrates. Again, the key thing really is root growth. The roots themselves are one of the things that are causing the pore spaces, opening up those areas for infiltration, opening those areas for water movement, air movement, and also the roots themselves between the root hairs and the glues that are exuded from the roots help to hold those soil particles together in those Lego block-like aggregates, which gives us structure along with pore space, places for the water to go and flow through. In this situation, we have a lighter, sandier soil, and what this grower has done is he is using a stripper header on the wheat to leave the residue out there to make sure that it has some type of snow catch. He has also planted a cover crop underneath of that. Now, this cover crop was planted fairly late with the intent that it is going to be small and not use a ton of water, not going very deep. And if we get a nice fall, he will go out there and actually terminate this cover crop before it uses too much water. The goal here is to have the residue left over, the tall residue holding snow, and the residue left on the surface to act as a blanket to protect it against the losses due to evaporation in this field. So we're trying to catch the snow and reduce what is lost through wind evaporation next spring. On this side, this is a different soil, same grower. He planted different types of plants in here. And these radishes were 20 days old and they grew about 16 inches down. And they're pumping water all the way down to 16 and maybe even deeper down than that, and moving that water out of the profile, making room for rainfall next spring and making room for that snow catch that's going to be there. The other thing with these radishes and this frost kill, we don't expect this to be a tall residue type of situation or heavy residue. We expect most of this to degrade and be out of the way. Again, aggregates. I can't stress it enough. Whether they're smaller aggregates in this picture or larger aggregates in the other picture, you want these little Lego blocks. They are the key to managing water in your field. And here, again, nice cover crop, planted mid to late fall. It's a partial mix of a frost kill of spring wheat and oats and a little bit of cereal rye. So the goal here is that this isn't necessarily a really wet field, but it isn't also a very dry field. It's somewhere in the middle. So we want to use a little bit of water this fall, move some of it out of the way, have a little bit of crop growing next spring in case it is too wet, that rye will grow and use some water and give us some trafficability, but also trying not to have a lot of tall standing residue in this situation to cause a lot of snow catch. So we're going for a middle ground in this. And you've got to try to practice this. Some years it works exactly the way you want it to. Some years it doesn't work quite the way you want it to. And if we're catching too much snow and it's too wet, we can let the cereal rye grow longer next spring to use more water. If it is not caught enough and we've used too much in the fall, then we can terminate the cereal rye very early in the spring to reduce the water usage. And it acts like the other one where we have the residue to prevent evaporation. This cover crop now, again, this is a little wetter soil, so we have a little bit more of a diverse mix. Again, the brassicas in here. I tend to use brassicas to move more water. They're actually fairly inefficient plants at moving water. They evaporate a lot of water from depth, so this helps us to dry it out. Plus, when they freeze, there's not a whole lot of residue left, and this is all frost kill here. So when this freezes, this is going to be frost kill. There's nothing going to be growing there next spring. And if we need to, we will come in and do some vertical tillage, light tillage on this, and to open it up just a little bit to get a little bit of evaporation. Now, this fall, doing soil samples, this was a less common occurrence than I wish it would have been. This is underneath the cover crop. This has decent moisture. You can see that it's not just powder flowing away from my hand here. It is, I'm able to clump it together, but it's also not wet and sticky. Now, I have on purpose crushed this up for soil sampling testing, but you can still see some of the aggregates left in this sample. And had I not crushed it, there would be a lot more aggregates in here. The water content is low, but not very dry, and it's certainly not very wet. Same grower, and across the field line, this field we could not get cover crops into, just did not get done. They did tillage instead. Now, the surface was dry, first surface 3 to 4 inches, like we saw with the vertical tillage. That was dried out nicely, but underneath, this is the 0 to 6 sample again, and this is extremely, extremely wet. Very muddy the whole way through. The aggregates are not there to help hold anything up, and there is a lot of water in the soil profile. It doesn't really look like it from the surface. We can drive across this field very readily, but there really is very little water holding capacity left. So any significant rains next spring, and we're going to be in a situation where we're going to have mud going very deep in that profile and being a significant problem. So again, my summary for you is that plants are a primary tool for your water management, and you can use them for both. You can use them to reduce excess moisture, and you can reuse them to help try to save moisture through the residue and cover it in that way. Either way, which one of the key things is to help build soil aggregates, because that allows for water infiltration into your soil, into and through your soil, and also allows for air exchange into and through your soil, which helps your plant growth as well. And then residue and structure are the two things that will help protect from too much evaporation that we can get from heavy tillage situations. So leaving some residue, having those aggregate structures out there, the water stays within the aggregate better than it does on the outside of it. And so that residue, along with the structure, helps reduce the amount of water loss from evaporation and also soil loss from blowing and those types of problems. Thank you for your time, and I hope that you will come later and ask questions, and have a nice day.